The world remembers Cleopatra as a queen who chose death rather than humiliation. A ruler who slipped from history with dignity intact. But that story is a lie built for comfort. Because Cleopatra's final days were not defined by choice. They were defined by collapse. By the time Rome closed in, Cleopatra had already lost everything that made her dangerous. Her army was shattered. Her allies were gone. Her power existed only in memory. What remained was not a queen facing fate, but a woman trapped inside a political machine designed to erase her. Rome did not need to kill Cleopatra immediately. It needed her alive. Alive, she could be displayed. Alive, she could be humiliated. Alive, she could be rewritten. Before we continue, if you want history stripped of myth and told without mercy, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe to the History Veil, like the video, and share it with those who believe the past should be confronted honestly. Now, let's continue. After the defeat at Actium, Cleopatra's world began to shrink rapidly. Alexandria, once the center of her power, became a cage. Roman ships dominated the coast. Roman envoys filled the city. Every message she sent was intercepted. Every move she considered was calculated against Roman interests. She was no longer negotiating from strength. She was negotiating for survival. Cleopatra understood Roman psychology better than most. She knew Rome did not fear armies as much as it feared symbols. And Cleopatra was a symbol that had to be destroyed carefully. Not through execution, but through transformation. Octavian wanted her alive because death would grant her control over the narrative. A living Cleopatra could be paraded through Rome, stripped of divinity, reduced to spectacle. She would walk behind Roman banners, not as a queen, but as proof that Rome dominated even the gods of Egypt. This was not speculation. It was Roman tradition. Cleopatra knew what happened to defeated queens. Chains. Public humiliation. A triumph designed to break the spirit before the body. Survival in Rome meant something worse than death. It meant erasure. Inside the palace, Cleopatra began to prepare for a future she could no longer control. She stockpiled poison. She studied Roman customs. She rehearsed negotiations she knew would fail. Every decision was made under surveillance. Roman agents watched her movements. Her correspondence was filtered. Her own palace had become hostile ground. Power had inverted completely. Once, men crossed deserts to kneel before her. Now, she waited for permission to speak. Her relationship with Antony collapsed alongside her empire. Antony's defeat stripped him of relevance. To Rome, he was already dead. To Cleopatra, he became a liability she could no longer protect. Their bond, once political and strategic, was reduced to shared desperation. When false reports reached Antony that Cleopatra had betrayed him, the damage was irreversible. His suicide was not heroic. It was chaotic, bloody, and humiliating. He did not die cleanly. He died slowly, carried to Cleopatra while bleeding out, unable to stand. Cleopatra watched the man who had once been her shield collapse in her arms. This moment shattered the last illusion of control. From that point forward, Cleopatra was alone. Rome tightened its grip. Octavian entered Alexandria not as a conqueror in battle, but as an administrator taking possession. Cleopatra was allowed to live. She was treated with restraint. Guards were placed, not chains. Courtesy replaced violence. This was intentional. She was too valuable to mistreat. Cleopatra attempted negotiation. She offered Egypt's wealth. She offered loyalty. She offered submission. Octavian listened politely and gave nothing in return. He had no reason to bargain. He already possessed everything that mattered. What he needed now was time. Time to transport Cleopatra to Rome. Time to prepare the spectacle. Time to strip her of myth. Cleopatra began to realize the truth. Rome did not care whether she lived or died. It cared about what her survival could be used for. As long as she breathed, she was a tool. Her children were removed from her presence. Her advisors silenced. Her access to the outside world severed. Isolation set in completely. The palace that once symbolized power became a waiting room for humiliation. Psychologically, this was devastating. Cleopatra had built her reign on perception. On ceremony. On control of image. Now, every image was being shaped by Rome. Every story about her future was being written without her. She was not facing execution. She was facing captivity inside history itself. Roman propaganda had already begun. Cleopatra was portrayed as an exotic corrupter. A seductress who weakened great men. A foreign threat to Roman order. None of this was accidental. It was groundwork. By the time she reached Rome, the audience would already know how to see her. As a warning. As a spectacle. As a defeated idea. Cleopatra understood something essential in those final days. Death would end her suffering. Survival would preserve it indefinitely. A living Cleopatra in Roman hands would exist without agency, without voice, without future. This was the true horror. Not that she would die. But that she would be kept. In the next part, we will go deeper into the psychological imprisonment Cleopatra faced after Antony's death. How Rome dismantled her identity piece by piece. And why the choice she eventually made was not an act of pride, but an escape from something far worse. Because Cleopatra did not choose death out of weakness. She chose it because survival had become unbearable. After Antony's death, Cleopatra entered the most dangerous phase of her life. Not because she faced execution, but because she faced something far more humiliating. She faced Roman ownership of her future. Octavian did not rush to kill her. He did not threaten her openly. Instead, he treated her with calculated restraint. Guards were polite. Conditions were controlled. Cleopatra was not imprisoned in chains, but in expectations. Rome wanted her calm. Alive. Cooperative. This was psychological warfare. Cleopatra was allowed to live inside her palace, but every decision required Roman approval. Her movements were restricted. Her visitors screened. Her messages intercepted. She was not alone, yet she was completely isolated. Rome understood her strength. Cleopatra's power had never come from armies alone. It came from narrative. From ceremony. From perception. She had ruled as a living symbol of divine authority. Now Rome worked systematically to dismantle that image. Roman propaganda accelerated. Cleopatra was portrayed not as a strategist, but as a seductress. Not as a ruler, but as a manipulator. Antony's downfall was blamed on her influence. Rome reframed the war as moral correction rather than conquest. Cleopatra became the embodiment of excess, corruption, and foreign danger. This narrative was intentional. By the time Cleopatra would arrive in Rome, the audience would already know how to see her. Not as a queen. As a warning. Cleopatra attempted to fight this with negotiation. She sent messages to Octavian offering Egypt's wealth, loyalty, and submission. She emphasized her willingness to rule as a Roman ally. Octavian listened carefully and gave nothing. He had no incentive to bargain. Cleopatra no longer controlled Egypt. Rome did. The negotiations were a performance. Each exchange reinforced Cleopatra's helplessness. Each unanswered proposal confirmed the truth. Rome did not want Egypt's cooperation. It wanted Egypt's submission. And Cleopatra was no longer a ruler negotiating terms. She was an asset awaiting transport. The psychological toll was immense. Cleopatra had spent her life controlling rooms. Now she waited in silence. She had once dictated outcomes. Now she reacted to them. Her identity, built on authority, began to fracture. Her children became leverage. Cleopatra understood that Rome could use them as hostages, symbols, or tools. Their fate depended entirely on her compliance. This awareness deepened her desperation. She was no longer fighting for a throne. She was fighting to preserve meaning. Isolation intensified. Roman guards replaced Egyptian attendants. Familiar faces vanished. Advisors disappeared. Cleopatra's palace felt foreign. She lived surrounded by luxury that no longer belonged to her. Luxury without control becomes mockery. Cleopatra began to study Roman triumphs obsessively. She knew exactly what awaited defeated rulers. Chains. Public display. Mockery. The stripping of titles and dignity. Women were paraded not for punishment, but for instruction. Rome taught obedience through spectacle. Cleopatra imagined herself in that procession. Not as a queen. Not as Isis incarnate. But as an object behind Roman banners. This vision haunted her. Her attempts to assert dignity were ignored. Roman officials treated her politely, but firmly. They did not argue. They did not threaten. They waited. Waiting was power. Cleopatra realized something terrifying. Rome did not need her to cooperate. It only needed her alive. Alive, she could be used. Alive, she could be humiliated. Alive, she could be rewritten. Her death would deny Rome that victory. This realization shifted her thinking. Cleopatra was no longer planning survival. She was planning escape. She examined poisons. She studied the effects. She tested methods discreetly. Every preparation was made under surveillance. Roman guards suspected nothing because they assumed compliance. Rome underestimated one thing. Cleopatra's understanding of control. She had ruled for decades by reading human behavior. She knew when people believed they had won. Octavian believed he had already won. That belief made him careless. Cleopatra staged submission. She appeared cooperative. Calm. Resigned. She spoke softly. She waited patiently. Roman officials saw what they expected to see. A defeated woman accepting her fate. But internally, Cleopatra was calculating. She understood that Rome's ultimate victory required her presence. A triumph without Cleopatra would feel incomplete. Rome wanted to display her as proof that no power, no divinity, no foreign ruler could resist Roman order. Cleopatra intended to deny them that moment. Her final days were marked by contradiction. Externally, she lived in quiet restraint. Internally, she prepared for erasure. Not erasure by Rome, but erasure on her own terms. This was not pride. It was refusal. Refusal to become a lesson. Refusal to become propaganda. Refusal to live as a symbol stripped of agency. Cleopatra's power had always been narrative. If Rome controlled the ending, it controlled her legacy. By choosing death, Cleopatra seized the final act. Rome feared this. Not because they valued her life, but because they valued her display. A Cleopatra who died on her own terms threatened Roman storytelling. It disrupted the clean triumph Rome desired. This tension defined her final days. Octavian delayed. He watched. He calculated. He wanted to be certain Cleopatra would remain alive until Rome. Cleopatra waited. She observed. She prepared. Both sides believed they were winning. Only one was right. In the next part, we will confront the moment itself. Not the myth. Not the legend. But the psychological truth behind Cleopatra's final decision. Why death was not defeat. And why survival would have meant something far worse. Because Cleopatra did not die to preserve pride. She died to escape Roman control. Cleopatra's final hours were not dramatic in the way history prefers to imagine them. There was no grand speech, no public audience, no last-minute rescue. What unfolded instead was quiet, deliberate, and terrifyingly clear. By this point, Cleopatra understood that Rome had already decided her fate. The only uncertainty left was whether she would be allowed to decide her own ending. Roman guards remained close, but respectful. Courtesy replaced threat. This was not kindness. It was confidence. Rome believed time was on its side. Cleopatra would be transported soon. The triumph was already planned. The narrative already written. Cleopatra had spent her life reading power. She knew when an opponent believed the outcome was sealed. That belief creates blind spots. She used those blind spots. Cleopatra presented herself as compliant. Calm. Accepting. She spoke less. She asked fewer questions. Roman officials interpreted this as resignation. They mistook control for surrender. Inside, her resolve sharpened. She prepared the final details quietly. No spectacle. No witnesses who could interfere. She understood that Rome's greatest weapon was interruption. She eliminated the chance for it. When the moment came, it was intimate. Private. Final. History later wrapped this act in myth. The ASP. The symbolism. The romantic tragedy. But the truth is simpler and more unsettling. Cleopatra chose death not because she worshipped honor, but because she understood captivity. Survival would have meant public erasure. She would have been marched through Rome as proof that foreign power bends. Her body would have belonged to Roman celebration. Her image rewritten by Roman voices. Her story reduced to cautionary tale. Alive, Cleopatra would have existed without authorship. She refused that future. Her death shocked Rome. Not because they valued her life, but because they valued her display. A triumph without Cleopatra felt incomplete. The symbol they intended to parade had escaped. Octavian was furious, but contained it. Publicly, he expressed disappointment. Privately, he understood the loss. Cleopatra had denied him the final act of domination. In death, Cleopatra reclaimed narrative control. Rome attempted damage control. Propaganda intensified. Her story was reshaped to minimize agency. She was painted as irrational. Emotional. Weak. Anything to obscure the fact that she had outmaneuvered them at the end. But the disruption remained. Cleopatra's death denied Rome the clean victory it wanted. The triumph went forward, but without its centerpiece. The absence was conspicuous. A silence at the heart of celebration. This absence haunted Roman memory. Cleopatra's children did not share her agency. They were absorbed into Roman systems. Some were paraded. Some disappeared from record. The dynasty ended not with conquest, but with assimilation. Egypt became Roman territory. Its gods were absorbed. Its symbols repurposed. Its queen reduced to legend. But legends carry residue. Cleopatra's story endured because it resisted Roman framing. She was never fully claimed by Roman narrative. Her intelligence, adaptability, and strategic thinking remained difficult to erase. Even in defeat, she complicated the story Rome wanted to tell. This is why Cleopatra remains unsettling. Not because she lost, but because she refused to be simplified. Her final decision was not about pride. It was about authorship. About choosing erasure on her own terms rather than existing as a living object in someone else's story. In this sense, Cleopatra's fate was worse than death only until death intervened. The true horror was the future Rome had prepared for her. A future without voice. Without choice. Without control. Cleopatra understood something essential that many overlook. Power does not end when armies fall. It ends when narrative control is lost. By choosing death, Cleopatra seized the only form of power still available to her. She denied Rome the satisfaction of completion. She disrupted the lesson Rome intended to teach. History prefers to remember her through romance and myth because the alternative is uncomfortable. The alternative reveals how empires operate when they want to dominate memory itself. Cleopatra's final act was not a retreat from history. It was an intervention. She refused to let Rome finish the story without her consent. That refusal echoes. Because it forces us to confront a deeper truth. That survival is not always freedom. That living can become a prison when control is total. And that sometimes, the most powerful resistance is denying an empire what it wants most. Cleopatra did not die to preserve pride. She died to preserve authorship. And in doing so, she ensured that history would never fully belong to Rome.